Hi everybody. Today I thought I might just talk a few minutes about Indigenous identity, particularly as it relates to Australia. So this is sort of an additional lecture discussion starter. So I'm going to ask the question, who are Indigenous Australians? I ask this question because a lot of people don't know, and the reasons that they don't know include the lack of information about Indigenous people, history and culture that has been taught in the education system. So generations of Australians have not really been taught about Indigenous people, and that's not the fault of individual people, okay? So today I'll talk about that a little. Now, Indigenous Australians have always had their identities placed on them by other people. They have been called terms such as half-caste, quarter-caste, full-blood and native by people who never really took the time to get familiar with their culture. Indigenous Australians were even called savages by the same people who rode around on horseback committing savage acts. Indigenous people did nothing that constituted savagery. One of the reasons why Indigenous people in Australia have such a strong and proud identity is because they have maintained a strong identity despite serious government attempts to destroy their identity. So this was done through official government policies. For example, today Australia prides itself on being a multicultural society. And I might just point out there that multiculturalism is not about people coming here and being like us. Multiculturalism is about people coming here and feeling comfortable and safe practicing their cultures. That's why it's called multi. Anything else would be assimilationist. Anyway, getting back to what I was talking about. Indigenous Australians have a proud identity because of the intentional attempts to destroy it through official government policy. Before we became a multicultural society, we had an official White Australia policy. And obviously this caused problems for Indigenous people because they did not fit into this social plan. So government set out to assimilate them into White Australia. And this was done in two ways. If the government said that you were a real Aborigine, you would go onto a reserve where you would be given tobacco and sugar and tea, and you would die out peacefully. If you were considered to be a part Aborigine, you were removed from your parents and placed in an institution where you'd be trained to be a white Australian. So, Indigenous people have a strong identity despite those attempts to destroy it. Indigenous Australians have always been held hostage to the images created about them and portrayed to the rest of us. It has always been those with power who determine who Indigenous people are, what they are, where they originated from, and where they belong. Again, we get back to this power word. When we're in power, we can take it for granted. For example, we may question someone about whether or not they're a real Aborigine. However, we don't contemplate the question about what constitutes a real Australian, for example. The reason we don't contemplate that is because we are in positions of power. And when we are in a power group, we can ask other people questions without people asking us the same questions. So, for example, we might ask people to tell us about their culture without contemplating how we can tell them about our culture. Ever since colonisation in 1788, Indigenous people have had their images created and portrayed to us, and in the main these representations have been extremely biased and deeply rooted in ethnocentric views. The representations of Indigenous Australians in the early days of colonisation were very much grounded in benefiting the new settlers. Popular stereotypes were created in order to justify, for example, the removal of kids and the removal of land. So, for example, some of you may have heard that the removal of Indigenous children was for their own good. Well, let me say that I have never heard a bigger load of rubbish ever. If the Indigenous parents at that time were given the same rights and services as other parents, that argument simply would not exist. If you refuse to pay people wages and then you come back and say, well, how can they look after their kids? The issue there is, why are they not getting wages? And of course, one of the reasons why Indigenous people around the world are living in poverty today is because they always worked. They have been a source of labour exploitation. If we were to put a video on of the White House from 100 years ago, the White House in America where the president lives, what would we see, do you think? Well, I think what we would see, if we were looking and if we knew how to look, is that all of the people doing all of the cooking, the gardening, the cleaning are all black slaves. This was also the case in Australia. For example, Indigenous people in Australia were the backbone of the cattle industry. They mastered the skills that were required against a lot of adversity, language barriers, for example, a lack of wages. So this is why when you see Indigenous people in rural and regional towns, older men dressed up in R.M. Williams gear, cowboy hats, listening to Slim Dusty, it's not just a coincidence. It was a large part of their lives, and they did it for rations of flour, sugar and tea. And when it became time to pay them equal wages, they were all sacked. Okay? So Indigenous people around the world have always worked. The fact that they didn't get paid is one of the reasons they are living in poverty today. Just one of the reasons. There are many others. What we've done with the Indigenous Australians is that we have othered them. Okay? So when we other people, we sort of put them into a category where it's okay to make comment about them, and they're not actually a part of us. So one good example of this would be the term refugee. I don't like the word. As I said, it's one of those words where you other people. Now, the very notion of Australia being declared terra nullius created the image that Indigenous Australians were less than human. Terms such as this implied that Indigenous Australians were an inferior, less than human race. So terra nullius basically implied that Aboriginal people were not here, that they didn't have a presence here, and that they were not connected to the land. These were just nomads who walked across the land, had no permanent presence here. This is what's implied by the term terra nullius. What many people do not know, however, is that the term terra nullius was only dismissed in the early 1990s through the Mabo decision. And I should point out here that the Mabo decision would not have went the way it did if it was not for the voluntary support and commitment of the white Australian lawyers who represented him. It's a little bit disappointing that after a reconciliation decade, none of us are able to know the names of the white Australian lawyers who represented Eddie Mabo for nothing. The fact of the matter is, Indigenous Australians probably would not have made the progress they have if it was not for the support of white Australians. Indigenous Australians, on the other hand, have never been given anything. They have had to struggle for the basic necessities, basic citizenship rights. We see the contribution white Australians have made to the Indigenous struggles all over the place. I've talked about Mabo and the white Australian lawyers who represented him. There were the freedom rides in the 1960s where Charles Perkins, an Indigenous man, some other Indigenous people and a whole group of white Australian university students hired a bus and drove around New South Wales country towns protesting about the discrimination, the overt discrimination that Indigenous Australians contended with on a daily basis. There are many examples of white Australians making this contribution. Vincent Lingiari and his people went on strike for about 8 years for equal wages and working conditions, and they had nothing while they were on the strike. So how could they last on this strike for 8 years? Well, because white Australians volunteered their time and took them water, took them food, clothing, and helped them with their struggle. Without that support, perhaps they wouldn't have lasted 8 years. There are many other examples. The first Aboriginal medical service was only established in Redfern in the early 1970s. It did not have a budget to attract and retain health professionals. So how did they deliver healthcare services? Well, white Australian health professionals volunteered their time. We should all know this, but unfortunately we do not. It is very important information for all of us to know, including Indigenous Australians. Similarly, in the United States, there were many white Americans who protested and campaigned and marched for civil rights in the 1960s, and today we have an African American president. So these struggles take a long time and they require the dedication of a lot of people. So most representations of Indigenous Australians have been negative and inaccurate, and based on a lack of correct information and popular stereotypes. Anthropologists, for example, portrayed Aboriginal people as a dying culture, and missionaries portrayed Aboriginal people as a people who needed to be saved by Christianity. They thought that Indigenous people had no presence of faith, religion. So therefore they said, well, if we go in and save these people, when they die, they will go to heaven. Anthropologists and missionaries have since discovered that Indigenous people in Australia and around the world are some of the most religious people in the world, because everything they do is determined by religion. There is no distinction between religion and the law in Indigenous societies, both of which are Western terms anyway. And of course, when you're using Western terms to describe non-Western things, there is always possibility for miscommunication and misinterpretation. I've explained to you what a sacred site is, and I'll touch on it here while I'm talking about Indigenous religion. In Australia, sacred sites can be anything. They can be a hill, a tree, a waterhole, a rock. What these things are to Indigenous people are places that their creator ancestors transformed into. So Indigenous people believe that their creator ancestors walked around, created the land, put them there, put the plants and the animals there, gave them their languages, and then those creator ancestors became part of the landscape, transformed into a tree or a waterhole or a rock hole, for example. So they are sacred sites, and Indigenous people have a lifelong commitment to care for those sacred sites, to sing the songs associated with those sacred sites, to perform the ceremonies, and to conduct the dances. Again, one person might just see a tree or a waterhole. Indigenous people might see a sacred site where their creator ancestor lives. Again, if we go back to the power issue, when we're in the power group, we can easily dismiss other people's religious beliefs and think of them as not being credible without even contemplating that our religious beliefs are just as unprovable as their religious beliefs. The reason why we don't think this is because we have been associated with a power group for so long. And of course, religion in any culture isn't about proving things. That is the job of science. So, Indigenous Australians are always having to prove who they are and are having to justify this. They are doing this in the workplace today, where, for example, if an Indigenous trainee is going to start in a position, they will need to prove by letterhead that they are actually Indigenous. And this is not an easy thing to do, because if you just moved to Darwin from Melbourne and you're an Indigenous person, you are relying on Indigenous organisations signing the letter to state that they can verify that you are Indigenous. If they do not know you or your family, they will not do this. The native title process is another example where Indigenous people have to prove who they are. Native title is where Indigenous people can have their rights and attachment to land recognised within the Western legal structure. So, native title is about Indigenous people demonstrating that they have continued to live in a traditional manner and that their laws and customs have continued to exist since the time that Britain declared sovereignty over Australia. Now, this entire notion of Indigenous people having to prove that their laws, for example, continue to exist is simply a denial of Australian history. And because of this, it is simply not fair and is an example of those with power pulling the strings. For example, if your parents were removed from their land and their parents and placed in an institution, you, your children and your parents cannot prove native title because your laws and customs have not continued to exist the same way they always have. Why? Because yous were removed. Well, you have no argument, because according to the Native Title Act, there is no provision for the removal of children. Either you can prove that your laws and customs have continued, or you cannot. Anyway, that's enough on native title. I'll move on. In the original constitution of 1900, the only references to Indigenous people in Australia were those of exclusion. And as a result of this, Aboriginal people were not citizens of Australia. It was not until the 1967 referendum that Indigenous Australians were first considered to be humans. However, despite this, most communities today, Indigenous communities, are still without basic citizenship rights. So what happened in 1967 is there was a referendum for Aboriginal people. The referendum was only about two things: giving power to the Commonwealth Government to intervene and take control of Indigenous affairs from state and territory governments whenever they wanted to. The second part of it was to include Aboriginal people in population estimates. Okay, now prior to this, Aboriginal people came under the Flora and Fauna Act, plants and animals. And as I said, they did not receive wages because nobody was under any legal obligation to pay animals and plants award wages. Okay, so the thing to remember, even though this 1967 Aboriginal referendum was only quite recent, and Aboriginal people at the time came under the Flora and Fauna Act, plants and animals, today Aboriginal people are politicians. Up until recently, nearly half of the front bench of the government here were Aboriginal. Aboriginal people are doctors. There's an Aboriginal Doctors Association because of this. Aboriginal people are professors. Aboriginal people are teachers. Aboriginal people are elite sports people. All of this has been done in a short amount of time, and contrary to popular belief, Aboriginal people have not been given anything. Okay? So there is no evidence out there that Aboriginal people get anything. There are scholarships, these sorts of things, but these scholarships and so on are for everybody. Women, people doing specific disciplines, mature age students. Scholarships are for everybody. Indigenous people in Australia are recognised as one of the 4 equal employment opportunity groups, along with people with disabilities, women and people from non-English speaking backgrounds. The reason that they are part of this group of 4 is because in the recent past, they overtly experienced discrimination. So those in the power group did not experience discrimination, and now when there are opportunities for those people who did experience discrimination, oftentimes those people who did have the power then will say, oh, they get everything. Okay? So it is just rubbish and untrue. And again, there is no evidence of this. No government department hands out houses or cars to Aboriginal people. It is just completely untrue. Now, Indigenous Australians are probably the most diverse group of people in Australia. There have never been one group of Indigenous Australians. There will never be, and there has never been one group of Indigenous Australians. There have always been many groups, despite people being given generic categories such as Aboriginal, Aborigines, Natives and Indigenous. It's important to remember that these terms are actually Western terms that have been placed on Indigenous people, again, by those with power. There are in fact many Indigenous groups. There are saltwater people, freshwater people, river people, snow people, desert people and rainforest people. Each of these groups have their own languages, their own religious beliefs, their own ceremonies and their own songs, dances and stories. They have their own cultures. This is because culture is not something that we're born with. For example, we're not born knowing how to use chopsticks. We're not born knowing how to play a didgeridoo. We are socialized into these things, okay? So our surroundings play an important part of our culture. Fish may be a daily diet, part of the daily diet for those living in coastal areas, may be a large part of their economic life. Those in the desert don't see fish, okay? So they wouldn't go fishing every day, for example. So culture is environmental. And as I said, each of these groups has their own beliefs. Someone in Central Australia would not have religious beliefs about a creator ancestor being half man and half octopus, for example. However, such a belief may exist in the Torres Strait Islands, for example. So there is lots of diversity. Now, this diversity is often not recognised in society, and often this can be seen when young kids in schools are asked to tell the class some Aboriginal. Well, that would be a bit like asking kids to tell the class some Australian. There is no such language. Okay? Aboriginal people have their own languages, and there is no one language traditionally. However, that's changed a little bit in recent times, because today there is a language called Aboriginal English, which is the most common language used in Australia. It is used all over Australia, regardless of Aboriginal people's geographical location and regardless of their background. Now, Aboriginal English came about when those Indigenous kids considered half-caste were put in institutions and were given orders not to use their traditional languages, so they had to start using English. However, they used it in a way that was not proper Australian or standard English, proper English. They developed it on the run. An example of this is an Indigenous person who may be a professor may say that he has writ the letter. He knows that in English you say wrote or written. However, writ is part of his first language in Aboriginal English. Okay, and it's difficult for people to stop using these terms when they are part of their first language. We see this with a lot of people who are from overseas and have come to Australia. Often they will say open the light and close the light. Now that might not make sense to us, but to them it makes perfect sense, so therefore there is no confusion. So while we're on language, I might just talk about one of the languages that is used around the coastal areas of Northern Australia. And this language came about through Macassan fishermen who were coming here for a long time before the Australian government disallowed them to continue coming. The Macassan fishermen were coming to catch trepang, and they had developed good relationships with Aboriginal people, and as a result Indigenous people in these areas adopted some of their languages and used these languages or terms to speak to other Aboriginal groups that they may have different languages with. And we see this today with words such as makang, rupiah, etc. These are Indonesian languages that have been adopted by Aboriginal people. In Central Australia there was a little bit of a different influence, and you can see this in some of the Indigenous people's surnames there. And this influence came about through Afghani cameleers who were taken to the Central Australian area to work in the desert with camels. And these people had children with Indigenous people, and as I said, we can see that in some surnames around today. And we can also see this the influence in other Indigenous people's surnames that may sound Chinese or Japanese, for example, because at the time Indigenous people and people who were not white Australian were restricted in terms of their social mobility. They could only be employed in certain industries, only play certain sports, and only play in certain teams, in certain competitions, etc. So these people often got together, socialised, exchanged ideas, and had children often. Okay. And we can see this with a lot of Aboriginal people's surnames, but the thing about this is these Aboriginal people, regardless of their surnames, still strongly identify as being black. Okay, so we need to remember now that when Indigenous people use the term black, they are not talking about a colour. They are talking about a social, common history of disadvantage. Remember, Native Americans are not black. The Sami are not black. Okay? Indigenous disadvantage has nothing to do with the physical characteristics that those in power have led us to believe were what being a real Indigenous person is all about. Okay? Has nothing to do with physical characteristics. Now, I was talking about Aboriginal English just a few seconds ago, and Aboriginal English is not just a means of communication. It's also an important way that Indigenous people express their identity with each other. So, for example, the words that an Indigenous person spoke to another Indigenous person would be completely different to the terminology they used when they were talking to non-Indigenous people. And this is about identifying with each other. While we are on languages, it is important to stipulate that languages or culture of Indigenous people did not just disappear. They were intentionally destroyed through official government policies. So, for example, many people believe that Indigenous people lost their language and lost their culture. Again, that's those in power influencing the way we talk about those issues. These things were not lost, they were intentionally destroyed through official government policy. It may sound like a bit of a play on words, but believe me, there is a huge difference there.